Welcome to Palm Sundays. I'm Nathaniel Bozolich. We're back and we're jumping into the second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew today. Thanks for tuning in. I've got my Bible here. I'm going to read from verses 1 till 12. If you have a Bible, you can open up and you can follow along. And then we're going to go through and I'm going to share some of the notes that I've come across as I've studied this chapter this week. Hopefully get you guys to a place that you can see something far more profound than just a story about some wise men coming to bring some gifts to a child Jesus. So, let's read the scripture. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and all the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring word to me, so that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them and came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own countries by another way. That's what Matthew's presenting. So, straight away, we see that he's showing us three different characters. And the three people I really want to sort of address and talk about. We've got the wise men, we've got Herod, and we've got these high priests and these scribes of the people. We also have a child, Jesus, and his mother, Mary. And just some really simple things to point out, first of all, is that there's no mention that there's three wise men. That is the story of Christmas, that three wise men came to baby Jesus and gave him gifts. Well, this story doesn't present any number of men. It just says wise men from the east. And it doesn't say that Jesus is a baby. It says he's a child. And it doesn't say he's in a manger. It says he's in a house. So we already know that there's more facts here that we haven't really addressed. More than likely, Jesus was between 1 and 2, and we know that because later on in the story, Herod will set out to kill any child under the age of 2. So I want to show you these three groups of people that Matthew is contrasting here. If I can give you an idea or a theme about what I'm talking about today, and what I think Matthew is trying to address here, is that the introduction, the birth, the kingship, and the divinity of Jesus is troubling to anybody who is not willing to accept it. Jesus is troubling. And chapter number 2 addresses that. The second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew addresses that Jesus will be troubling to those who don't know what to do with Jesus. How do I get there? Let's have a look. First of all, the wise men. It says there were men that came from the east. Now, more than likely, they came from Persia, a place that was known for studying the stars. Now, God pointed out a particular star to these men, and for whatever reason, he stirred something in their hearts for them to drop everything they were doing and to travel to Jerusalem. Now, these men traveled a great distance. Sometimes we forget that. We don't have cars, trains, or planes. So these men traveled possibly 3 to 6 months to seek out the King of the Jews. When they say we're searching for the King of the Jews, it tells us that they're not Jewish. And they tell us why they've come to seek him out, to worship him. How many times have people come to me and said, "Nathaniel, I love Jesus. I respect Jesus. I think he was a great prophet. He was a great teacher. But where does it say that he's God? Where does it say that I'm meant to worship him as God?" Your answer? Chapter number 2 of the Gospel of Matthew. These men said, "We have come to worship him." And when they saw him, when they got to his house and they saw this child Jesus, they came and they worshipped. They fell down and they worshipped him and they brought him gifts. Now think about this. These men had traveled possibly 3 to 6 months to the land of the Jewish people. What a surprise it must have been for them when they arrived in Jerusalem, the home of the Jewish people, and no one's celebrating the birth of this king. I mean, they brought gifts. So possibly they were expecting to walk into a huge celebration about this coming king that was to be worshipped. Yet no one knew about it. Now, it doesn't say that there was 3, but they must have been significant in number or significant in status because they were able to get in front of King Herod and ask the question, where is he who was born King of the Jews? Now, Herod, this must have been troubling, and it says it was troubling, but why was it troubling? Well, let's learn a little bit about King Herod, also known as Herod the Great. He was a man of achievements. He built Masada. He built Caesarea Maritima. He extended the Temple Mount, and the retaining wall that Herod had built still exists today in the old city. He was a man who was obsessed with power and authority. There's a story that says that Herod was so concerned about that no one would mourn at his death, at his funeral, that he instructed that a group of influential men around him also be killed, so that he could guarantee that the day of his funeral would be full of mourning. This is a man who is obsessed with being worshipped. So just imagine his shock when these men from the east had come and said, we have come to worship the King of the Jews who's just been born, a child. And what's challenging for Herod is he achieved all these great things and he was leading, in his eyes, this Jewish nation. But these men had come to worship Jesus, not for his achievements, but for who he was. God with us. Herod was troubled. And Herod was so troubled that he even wanted to kill the idea of Jesus. And as you continue reading in the 2nd chapter of Matthew, you see that he instructs that every child under the ages of 2 be killed in Bethlehem. He wanted to remove the kingship of Jesus. For Herod, this was troubling news. And Matthew presents that trouble of a king who was desperate to hold on to his power, worldly power. Let's move to the chief priests and the scribes. Now, we know that these men knew Scripture. How do we know this? Because when Herod went to the high priest, when he went to the scribes of the people, he asked the question, well, where is this Christ meant to be born? And they immediately said, Bethlehem. Micah 5:2. That the ruler will come from Bethlehem. That this ruler from the line of David, who is meant to shepherd the sheep of Israel, will be born in Bethlehem. This tells us something fascinating. They knew that a Messiah was coming that was going to rule. They knew that God had made this promise, and they knew where this Messiah was going to be born. But they didn't go to Bethlehem. There's no mention of the high priest or any of the scribes traveling to Bethlehem to seek out he who has been born King of the Jews. They rejected the news, but instead were troubled by the news that had come from these wise men. You have 2 people now who are troubled. Now it says all of Jerusalem was troubled by this news. Now why would all of Jerusalem be troubled by the news of the Messiah, a promise that God made to his people from the prophets of old? To understand that, we have to jump back into Scripture. I'm going to take you to Jeremiah 23. Now you have to know that these men who knew Scripture knew all Scripture. And they would have known about the prophecy about the Messiah in Jeremiah 23. The challenges that God makes. So God says this, Jeremiah 23, woe to you shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. If you go down further, it says this, behold, I will attend to you for your evil deeds, declares the Lord. Who's God talking to right now? He's talking to the shepherds of the sheep of Israel, the Jewish leadership. Woe to you shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. Verse 5, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. Let's go to, actually before we go there, I want you to hear the language that God uses. He has a problem with the leadership of Israel right here. He has a problem with the high priest. He has a problem with the scribes of the people who are meant to be leading the sheep of Israel. He is declaring that they have destroyed and scattered the sheep. And not only is it that he's going to deal with their evil deeds, but that he's going to raise up a king. These men knew scripture, and if these men knew Micah 5:2, they also knew Jeremiah 23. Now, what I find interesting about the Bible is when things start to match up. Jeremiah 23, the language, woe to you, shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. If you turn to Matthew 23, look at the language that Jesus uses when he's standing before the scribes and Pharisees. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. 7 times Jesus will use this language, woe to you. He accuses them of failing to lead the people back into a relationship with God. He says, on the outside you may look good, but on the inside you are dirty and corrupted. When you go to Ezekiel 34, we get the same sort of idea, God talking about shepherding sheep and talking about how he has an issue with the shepherds of Israel. Jeremiah 23, Ezekiel 34. So, God points out that you have neglected the weak, you have neglected the sick, you have ignored the injured, and you care not for the lost. You have ruled with force and harshness. And God says in Ezekiel 34, he says, I am against the shepherds. Now, what's even more interesting, when you get down to verse 11, God's language changes and he says, I myself will search for the sheep and I will seek them out. I will. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep. I myself will make them lie down, declares the Lord. I will seek the lost. I will bring them back. I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be their prince among them. I am the Lord, and I have spoken. These men knew scripture, and these men knew exactly what was going on if the Messiah was born. All of a sudden, it was a judgment on their leadership. So, to ask the question, why was all of Jerusalem, the high priest and the scribes of the people, troubled by the news of this coming Messiah? It was bad news for them. It meant that they either had to take responsibility for their actions or they had to reject it and ignore it. Who wants to be the generation that is not living up to God's expectation? And Jesus says this, all things will come upon this generation in Matthew 23. The Jewish leadership of Jesus' time was the generation that God was talking about in Jeremiah 23 and Jeremiah 34. And that's why it's so important to know Scripture. It's so important to understand Scripture. Now look, let's get back to it. So we know that these wise men came and they chose to worship Jesus. We know that Herod was a king of power and he chose to try and kill the idea of Jesus. And we know that these chief priests and these scribes and the people of Israel chose to reject the Messiah because they didn't want to be the generation that was not living up to God's expectation. Jesus is troubling. And Matthew is presenting a contrast to who Jesus is troubling to. If I choose to not acknowledge the introduction, the birth, the kingship and the divinity of Jesus, all of a sudden he is going to become very troubling in my life. How do we know this to be true? Well, Jesus himself said, Matthew 10:34, I have not come into the world, I have not come to bring peace to the world, but a sword. I have not come to bring peace to the world, but a sword. Let's read that scripture. Because many people look at this, and this is sometimes what's skipped over in churches because it gets a little bit too uncomfortable. But this is the truth of who Jesus is, and that Jesus will always be troubling to people who aren't willing to accept him. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a person's enemy will be those in his own household. Whoever loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of following me, and whoever loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of following me. And whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Jesus is saying, I'm troubling. If you don't know where to place me, I will be troubling for you, and I have come to divide people. Yes, I bring peace, but I bring peace to the individual who has stopped and acknowledged who I am, and who is willing to bring me his time, his talents, and his treasure, and he's willing to worship me. But for those who reject that, those who want to kill that idea or ignore that idea, I'm going to be troubling. And I'm going to divide people. Who is Jesus? In Colossians 1:15 it says that he is the image of the invisible God. The introduction of Jesus is simple. He removed that comfortable distance we thought we had with God. The undescribable has now become describable in the embodiment of who Jesus was. This is what Matthew is presenting in the second chapter. Matthew is challenging an audience to see that the introduction of his very name will divide people. It's challenging scripture, but it's comforting scripture because you see a contrast between these two groups. Now let's go back to the wise men who elected to worship him as God. As the story goes on, it said that they had great joy. They were joyful. Yet they had traveled for months and they were offering something themselves, yet they were still joyful to worship Jesus. Not for what he had achieved, but for who they saw him to be. God among us, Emmanuel. Now, the sad part of the story is this. People have this fear of Jesus like he has come to condemn them. Herod thought that Jesus had come to take his power. The high priests and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law thought he'd come to condemn them. But had they gone to him and confronted him, they too may have found peace. A peace that the world can't offer. Now, where do I find this? There's a famous verse that most Christians know. It's John 3:16, but I actually want to take you to John 3:17. The words of Jesus. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. See, Jesus didn't come to condemn the world. He came to save the world, but the only ones who will be saved are the ones who are willing to believe in him. And if you choose not to believe in him, you condemn yourself. Herod condemned himself. The high priests, the Pharisees, the scribes of the Jewish people who thought they knew the law, they condemned themselves by not stopping and acknowledging that Jesus was God. So we're faced with a choice, and that's what makes Jesus uncomfortable. That Jesus enters into the story, you are faced with a choice. Do I accept or reject? Do I acknowledge or refuse? Do I ignore or do I follow? Jesus is troubling because Jesus forces you to make a choice. He's always going to force you to make a choice. In every single moment of every single day. That's why the language of Jesus is so fascinating. He says, follow me. Follow me. And I want to show you one more verse in the scriptures, and I'm going to leave it at that for today. I want you to go to Micah 6:8. It's the same prophet where the scribes knew that Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem. It says this, Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Few things. Right off the bat, God says, I've told you what is good, and I'm going to tell you what is good again. And then he says, and you know what I require of you. Stop right there. God requires something of me. I was created for a reason. I was created for purpose. Well, what's the requirement? God isn't just a one-way transaction where I get what I want and then I go about my life. Though clearly in this scripture, God says, He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness. And here's the kicker, and to walk humbly with your God. You see, to walk humbly with your God means that you're not leading, you're following. So we're presented with a choice again. We either follow a God that we believe in, or we control a God that we create. But Jesus is not the kind of God that you can control. He's the God that says, follow me. Jesus is troubling. And the Gospel of Matthew, the 2nd chapter, presents that very dilemma. For those who worship Him as King, as God, they will have joy, they will have peace, and they will be protected and be led another way home. You see, the wise men were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. Had they returned to Herod, they would have faced their death. But God protected them because they worshipped Him, and they were led another way home. Don't lose the idea that Jesus is troubling. For the Christians, know that He's going to be troubling. He's going to be troubling for people to have conversations with. He's going to be troubling because all of a sudden, Jesus presents every single person with a simple choice. I am God, but do you choose to follow me? That's Palm Sundays. That's the 2nd chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Lots of insight there. I hope you learned something, and I hope all of you who have been following along this journey are being blessed this week. I'm looking forward to sharing more with you. Much love, and continue to seek out His face. That even though Jesus is challenging, Jesus brings peace to those who believe in His name. We're not condemned, but we are saved. Much love, and I'll talk to you guys soon.